It's Friday, the 4th of November, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by our correspondent in Edinburgh and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. On the programme this week, the Home Secretary defends herself following criticism of her security breaches. She also faced criticism over her handling of asylum seekers, and in the Commons she said this.
We need to be straight with the public. The system is broken. Illegal migration is out of control.
But pressure continued on the government at Prime Minister's questions over failures in the asylum system.
His Home Secretary says the asylum system is broken. Who broke it?
The Home Secretary and I, when it comes to tackling on migration, reducing migration, we are on the same page. That party's policy, it's a blank page, Mr. Speaker.
The government announces all poultry in England must be kept indoors under new restrictions to fight the country's largest ever bird flu outbreak. And Scotland's Finance Minister unveils further spending cuts.
Today I have published an emergency budget review that sets out a further £615 million in savings.
Let's start here at Westminster with our parliamentary correspondent, Sean Curran. Sean, it's been an extremely difficult week for the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. She was reappointed as Home Secretary by Rishi Sunak just 6 days after she was forced to resign by the previous Prime Minister, Liz Truss. What happened?
Yes, so she was forced to resign because of a breach of the ministerial code, and this was because she had sent an official document using her personal email. We hadn't heard from Suella Braverman in the Commons following that, or following indeed her reappointment. And then there was a letter that she sent this week to the Home Affairs Committee in which she revealed that this wasn't the only time that she'd used her personal phone to send documents. She'd emailed some documents to her personal phone. So there were a lot of questions that people had about what was going on there. And then running along underneath was this extraordinary hearing that we'd had the week before from the Inspector of Asylum and Borders, the independent watchdog, who had criticised in very strong language the conditions he had found at the Manston processing site, an ex-military base where people are sent for their asylum claims to be processed, and they're only supposed to be there for a day or two before they're then moved to other accommodation. And the whole site is supposed to take about 1,600 people, and he said that there were 4,000 people there, and some of them had been there for some weeks. So there were a lot of questions for the Home Secretary to answer. She did come to the Commons this week to make a statement, and that's when, as we heard, she made some very colourful and controversial comments about the immigration system.
As members will be aware, we need to meet our statutory duties around detention and also fulfil legal duties to provide accommodation for those who would otherwise be destitute. We also have a duty to the wider public to ensure that anyone who has entered our country illegally undergoes essential security checks and is not immediately free to wander around local communities with no fixed abode. I foresaw the concerns at Manston in September and deployed additional resource and personnel to deliver a rapid increase in emergency accommodation. To be clear, like the majority of the British people, I am very concerned about hotels, but I have never blocked their usage.
Can she confirm that she turned down plans, contingency plans that she was offered that would have reduced overcrowding, as the reports say? Every day since her reappointment, there have been more stories about possible security or ministerial code breaches. How is anybody supposed to have confidence in her, given the serious responsibilities of the Home Secretary to stand up for our national security, for security standards and for public safety? The Prime Minister promised that this would be a government of integrity, of professionalism and of accountability. Isn't the Home Secretary letting everyone down and failing on all of these counts?
We need to be straight with the public. The system is broken. Illegal migration is out of control, and too many people are more interested in playing political parlour games, covering up the truth, than solving the problem. I, Madam Deputy Speaker, am utterly serious about ending the scourge of illegal migration.
That facility operated absolutely magnificently and very efficiently indeed until 5 weeks ago, when I'm afraid the Home Secretary took the policy decision not to commission further accommodation. And it is that that has led to the crisis at Manston.
Responsibility for the disaster and dysfunction at Manston and the unlawful detention conditions there lies squarely with the Home Secretary herself and her predecessors. She and they knew what was happening, including the numbers arriving, and she was provided with advice that, by all accounts, she did not act on. Now, she's very carefully said that she did not block hotel use, but did she at any point avoid supporting new procurement?
If she spent less time playing to the gallery on immigration and more time dealing with the practical problems, this would be to the benefit of the taxpayer, the Home Office staff that work so hard, and to the asylum seekers themselves.
We have a very slow-moving system. That is unacceptable, and that is a big part of the problem. And part of our plan to solve the problem is to speed up asylum processing.
She talks as if the hotels are somehow a better option. In my constituency, there is one with 150 children in, squeezed alongside another 350 adults, 7 or 8 to a room. No notice to the local authority they would be placed there. No cooking facilities. No school places for these primary school-aged children.
I think it's a fallacy to suggest that we're somehow cutting corners. When I've arrived at the Home Office, I've been, frankly, very dismayed and appalled to find that we're spending, on average, £150 per person per night to accommodate people in hotels. By my standard, that's quite a nice hotel. And upon my review and closer scrutiny of how that decision-making was taking place, I identified several 4-star hotels around the country being procured for this purpose. For me, that's not an acceptable use of taxpayers' money.
If people don't want to go to Manston, they can stay in France. But we all know what's really behind these unpleasant personal attacks is because this Home Secretary is the only one with the guts, the determination, the legal knowledge to reform our ridiculous human rights law and detain these people, which is the only way, and send them back, the only way that we're going to deal with this. And those who constantly make these personal attacks to somebody who has made just one mistake and apologise, to remember the old motto, understand and judge not.
And questions, Sean, over conditions at the Manston Processing Centre continued at PMQ's Prime Minister's Questions, where Rishi Sunak faced the Labour leader Keir Starmer. What sort of unfolded?
Yeah, well, this was only the second time, actually, that Rishi Sunak had taken Prime Minister's questions. And to some extent, Suella Braverman had set the scene for the exchanges between the Prime Minister and the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, with those comments about the immigration system. But we also saw, I think, a rehearsal and a repeat of some of the attack lines that we heard during their first meeting across the dispatch box when Sir Keir Starmer, I guess he is one of those people that Sir Edward Lee is talking about, had criticised the decision to reappoint Suella Braverman, and he had accused the Prime Minister of doing, in his words, a dodgy deal with the Home Secretary in order to get her support in the Tory leadership election. So we had all of that again mixed in with this new row about the state of the immigration system.
His Home Secretary says the asylum system is broken. Who broke it?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we can look at the record on migration policy. Let's look at it. What did we on this side of the House do? We gave the British people a referendum on Brexit. We delivered Brexit. We ended the free movement of people, Mr. Speaker. That's our record on migration policy. It's not something the honourable gentleman supported. He opposed it at every turn, and it's not what the British people want.
He says he's getting a grip, he's got a plan. So let's have a look at that plan. The Rwanda deal was launched in April. It cost the taxpayer £140 million and rising. The number of people deported to Rwanda is 0. Since then, 30,000 people have crossed the Channel in small boats. It's not working, is it? He hasn't got a grip.
Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the House are clear that we want to defend our borders. When the Shadow Home Secretary this weekend was asked, she couldn't answer a simple question if the party opposite was in favour of higher or lower migration. It's that simple. The Home Secretary and I, when it comes to tackling on migration, reducing migration, we are on the same page. That party's policy, it's a blank page, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, blame others, deflect, attack on something else. So much for the new age of accountability. Of all the people who arrived in small boats last year, how many asylum claims have been processed?
Not enough is the answer, very straightforwardly. Not enough. And that's what we're going to fix. But the honourable gentleman raises this question. What are we doing? We've increased the number of processing officials by 80%. We are putting an extra 500 more by next March. But if he really was serious about fixing this problem, then he would acknowledge that we do need to tackle the issue of people putting spurious claims, spurious, repeated, last-minute claims to frustrate the process. That's how we'll tackle the system. So why, then, did he vote against the Nationality and Borders Act, which deals with it?
Mr. Speaker, he says not enough. You could say that again. It's 4%. 4% of people arriving in small boats last year had their asylum claim processed. According to the bookies, the Home Secretary has a better chance of becoming the next Tory leader than she has of processing an asylum claim in a year. And he talks about numbers. They're only taking half the number of asylum decisions that they used to. That's why the system is broken. 4,000 people at the Manston Air Force Base, massively overcrowded, all sorts of diseases breaking out. So, did the Home Secretary receive legal advice that she should move people out? Yes or no?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is very fond of reminding us that he used to be the former Director of Public Prosecutions. So he knows the government's policy on commenting on legal advice. But what I can say is the significant action that the Home Secretary has taken to fix the issue. Since September, 30 more hotels with 4,500 new beds, appointing a senior general to control the situation at Manston, and indeed increasing the number of staff there by almost a half, Mr. Speaker. These are significant steps to demonstrate that we are getting a grip of this system.
I think the answer to the question whether the Home Secretary received legal advice to move people out of Manston is yes. He just hasn't got the guts to say it. He did a grubby deal with her, putting her in charge of Britain's security just so he could dodge an election. She's broken the ministerial code, lost control of a refugee centre and put our security at risk. She did get one thing right. She finally admitted that the Tories have broken the asylum system. Criminal gangs running amok, thousands crossing the Channel in small boats every week, hardly any claims processed. So why doesn't he get a proper Home Secretary, scrap the Rwanda gimmick, crack down on smuggling gangs, end the small boat crossings, speed up asylum claims and agree an international deal on refugees? Start governing for once and get a grip.
The right honourable gentleman rightly raised the topic of national security, because it is important. But this is the person who in 2019 told the BBC, and I quote, "I do think Jeremy Corbyn would make a great Prime Minister." Let's remember Mr. Speaker, let's remember that national security agenda, abolishing our armed forces, scrapping the nuclear deterrent, withdrawing from NATO, voting against every single anti-terror law we tried, befriending Hamas and Hezbollah. He may want to forget about it, but we will remind him of it every week, because it's the Conservative government that will keep this country safe.
In May of this year, the new Prime Minister told this chamber, and I quote, "I can reassure the House that next year's benefits will be uprated by this September's CPI, and the triple lock will apply for the state pension." But last week, the Prime Minister repeatedly refused to say if he would keep to a promise that he made only 5 months ago. Prime Minister, people don't need to hear any more spin about compassionate conservatism. People just need a straight answer to a simple question. Will he keep his promise and lift benefits and pensions in line with inflation?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, we do now have an excellent new Chancellor, and I'm looking forward to his autumn statement in a couple of weeks. It wouldn't be right to comment on individual policy measures before then, but I think everyone knows we do face a challenging economic outlook and difficult decisions will need to be made. But what I would say is that we will always, as my track record as Chancellor demonstrates, have fairness and compassion at the heart of everything we do.
And we'll find out more, of course, Sean, what's in the autumn statement on the 17th of November. But briefly, viewers may have been wondering, those eagle-eyed amongst them, why so many MPs had those sheaths of wheat attached to their lapels. What was that about?
This is a campaign from the National Farmers Union. It was Back British Farming Day, and I can tell you that those of us who were there, we could see there was a government whip, had a large bag of these badges made from wheat from Shropshire, I'm told. Yeah. And they had a big bag of those, and they were handing them out to ministers as they took their places on the front bench. Though, as you might have seen, not everybody won. Rishi Sunak did not have one on.
Well, they're quite big, aren't they? Might not have been enough room on the...
Not on those lapels, those fashionable lapels.
Come back to you later on in the programme, Sean, because we're going to Holyrood and joining our political correspondent there, Andrew Kerr. Andrew, hello to you. There was an emergency review of the budget on Wednesday, and we'll come to that in just a moment. But first of all, the political week began with fireworks, quite literally, as mobs confronted police and set off pyrotechnics, prompting questions in the Scottish Parliament. Tell us about it.
Yes, that's right, Joe. There was a lot of concern from residents in Dundee and local politicians after the events on Monday night. Youth lit fire in the roads. They were throwing fireworks at police in full riot gear. Extra police deployments had to be sent into the city. These were pretty unusual scenes for the city of Dundee, and the Justice Secretary, Keith Brown, described them as appalling. Now, Mr. Brown was also claiming that legislation aimed at cracking down on the sale of fireworks in Scotland had proved to be helpful. But on Tuesday in the Chamber, the Conservatives were questioning that and saying there were issues with some parts of the legislation that still had to be officially introduced.
The Cabinet Secretary mentioned the new fireworks licensing scheme, and although it's not in place yet, one flaw is that those convicted of antisocial behaviour do not need to disclose this when applying for a fireworks licence. Will the Cabinet Secretary admit the SNP mistake on this and review the decision in light of last night's events?
Cabinet Secretary. Well, this Parliament passed that Act, and I support the provisions of that Act. And the member, I'm not saying deliberately, but may have jumped over the fact that two vital provisions of that Act are in force now. So in terms of proxy buying for young children, and also crucially in terms of the aggravating factor, if somebody is found guilty, the court is now, as of the passing of that Act, required to take that into account in terms of any disposal. The member is right to say there are other parts of the Act which have yet to come into force, as was said at the time of the passing of that Act, and those will be brought into force according to the timescales that we have.
The events of yesterday evening were absolutely disgraceful. I welcome Police Scotland's urgent pursuit of the perpetrators. I can confirm to the Cabinet Secretary that, having spoken to Tesco this afternoon myself, that they have now confirmed that they will cease sales. Would the Cabinet Secretary join in the calls from local politicians that all retailers should cease sales on a voluntary basis to increase the confidence of local people that there will not be repetitions this weekend? Obviously, public displays have recently been cut by the City Council. Can he also give us any information on additional resources that can be brought from the fire service and police around Scotland to ensure that the public have confidence for this weekend?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank the member for the action that he's taken? This may develop into a pattern. We've got Asda, we've now got Tesco. Perhaps we can go further. I would say that it's different for different retailers. You'll be aware that some small retailers, it can be a large part of their income. So I would just say what I have said already, that I welcome the action that both the members taken and Joe Fitzpatrick, as the local member, has taken, and also point out the extent to which the police are very pleased to see the action that's been taken. In relation to what he asks of me in relation to further information about the police plans for this weekend, I understand why the member is interested. Happy to speak to him with more information, perhaps offline, but I don't want to arm others, if you like, by putting in the public domain some information that might not be useful. But other than to say that the resources that will be available in Dundee this weekend are being augmented.
The Scottish Cabinet Secretary for Justice there. Andrew, cuts to services and savings were the order of the day on Wednesday, following an announcement by the Scottish Government. Tell us about it.
Yes, that's right. Now, the Scottish Government had promised this emergency budget review due to the worsening financial situation. £1.7 billion has been eroded from the Scottish Government budget due to inflation. Now, the Acting Finance Secretary, John Swinney, has already announced £500 million of savings. And on Wednesday, he came back to the Chamber here and announced another massive tranche of savings, £615 million. We'll hear from Mr Swinney in just a second. But the Scottish Conservatives in the debate alluded to some difficult domestic situations. Labour picked up on the External Affairs Secretary spending a lot of time abroad. And the Lib Dems questioned about the purpose of spending £20 million on a second independence referendum. We'll hear from them in a second, but first, here's Mr Swinney.
Presiding Officer, when I set out the initial package of £560 million in savings in 2022-23, I was clear that additional savings would still be required. Today, I have published an emergency budget review that sets out a further £615 million in savings. This includes £400 million from reprioritisation of spend within health and social care to provide a fair pay offer for NHS staff and to meet the extraordinary pressures from inflation and demand as the service begins to recover from the pandemic. This has included rephasing some social care spending in line with expected spending profiles and repurposing spend in other areas such as mental health.
Can I also acknowledge the difficult circumstances in which the Scottish Government finds itself? Some of them obviously are international, some of them have been domestic, and I fully acknowledge that part of the difficulty is the timing of the forecasts and of the budget. And these difficulties are substantial for the Cabinet Secretary, and I fully understand why he can't say a bit more about tax policy just now.
I think the complete sentence that Liz Smith was trying to get out at the beginning of her of her contribution was to acknowledge the difficulties created for me by the decisions of the United Kingdom, as well as the timing decisions. So I think we should just allow me to just complete that sentence for Liz Smith.
But I note that the Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs has travelled to 8 countries in as many months, clocking up almost 22,000 air miles. So what cost control measures are being applied to the expenditures of members of the government and civil servants?
The choices this government have made are manifestly wrong as well. Irrespective of when that £20 million is allocated for, we're still spending civil service time and money on the production of constitutional papers, £17 million on national testing every year, and up to £1 billion on the ministerial takeover of social care. All the while, councils are being squeezed to the pips, long COVID sufferers continue to struggle without, and £38 million is being stripped from mental health. On this last point, can I ask the Deputy First Minister, what has changed in the severity of the national mental health crisis that he can find that level of money to cut from the mental health budget?
Deputy. Well, Joe, in relation to Labour's point, Mr Swinney was saying that Scotland had to stay connected to the rest of the world, and to pick up what the Lib Dems were saying on mental health, well, Mr Swinney was saying he didn't want to cut the budget, but it showed the severity of the situation. And when it came to IndyRef 2 and the £20 million being spent on that, that's to be spent in the next financial year and not this one.
Andrew, the emergency budget review, perhaps unsurprisingly, came up as the First Minister faced questions on the state of the NHS.
That's right. At First Minister's questions on Thursday, Nicola Sturgeon was asked about that. The Conservatives were criticising the cuts to the mental health budget, while Scottish Labour highlighted some critical issues in the National Health Service. Their leader was saying that an 81-year-old woman in the west of Scotland who's suffering with bone cancer had to wait more than 24 hours for an ambulance after she fractured a pelvis. Now, the First Minister was calling for more powers for this place and blamed the Conservatives for their mismanagement of the economy, in her words. She was saying that to Anna Sarwar from Labour after he asked this question.
Week after week, year after year, the First Minister comes and tells people it's unacceptable and then expects people to accept the unacceptable with devastating consequences across the country. Change the script, First Minister. Because Katrina's experience is not an isolated one. One of the reasons ambulances aren't available is because they are queuing outside A&E waiting to drop off patients.
Our NHS is not immune from wider economic and budgetary decisions that unfortunately are out with the hands of this government. I wish we could invest much more in our National Health Service. And I agree very much with the Welsh First Minister, Mark Drakeford, where he recognises that while it's his responsibility to manage the health service in Wales, that has been impacted by the decisions of the Tories at Westminster. He can recognise that. I'm left wondering why Anna Sarwar, instead of making sure that people understand the impact of Tory decisions, wants to pretend that that doesn't exist.
So, Joe, those political fireworks will continue for some time, and those two very significant issues, those big funding constraints that we have been seeing this week, and of course as the NHS experiences more winter difficulties here in Scotland and in the rest of the UK.
Andrew Kerr, thank you very much for that from Holyrood. Let's return to Westminster. Our correspondent here, Sean Curran. Sean, following the publication this week of a very damning report into misogyny and sexism in police forces in England and Wales, MPs questioned police chiefs. What happened?
Yes, this is a report that was commissioned by the then Home Secretary, Priti Patel, after a serving police officer was convicted of the murder of Sarah Everard, a case that shocked everybody in the country, including many politicians at Westminster. And what happened was there was a review of 8 police forces in England and Wales, and the watchdog looked at the vetting procedures and they looked at the culture, and they found a lot of failings. The suggestion is that there could be hundreds, if not thousands, of police officers serving in forces who shouldn't really be there. This week, the MPs on the Home Affairs Committee got to speak to senior police officers. Now, you will hear a lot of initials in the first question, and they stand for His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, Fire and Rescue Services.
Well done.
The very disturbing report that came out this morning from HMIC FRS, having looked at that, I just wondered, what is the problem? What's the problem that the police have with women?
I think a number of the particular examples will be quite shocking to members of the public. Now, there's a lot of work that has been going on in relation to this. As has already been alluded to, we've had issues, and there have always been issues, and we've done lots around culture. But I think once it became known that the kidnapper and murderer of Sarah Everard was a serving police officer, I think that shocked the organisations into a different place, really. Every chief constable over the last year, 18 months, has gone back through into their organisations and done a number of things. One of those things is really looking at how well each organisation is adhering to the code of practice in relation to vetting and the practices, and that work goes on. Another is creating a culture in the organisations where it is very, very clear from the top that it is unacceptable, the kind of behaviours that we've seen and some of the kind of behaviours and the sexism and the misogynistic behaviours that you refer to.
It's not endemic thing. Is it endemic in the culture of the police? There's misogyny?
I think misogyny is endemic in society,
So it's endemic in the police.
And the police are representative of society. But what I would say is it's more important that we root that out in our organisation because of the role that we have as a service and the powers that we have. The really important point is we've gone back, every force has gone through all of the issues that are being dealt with through their misconduct processes. They've been accelerating their processes. And what that has meant is, and we've all seen it, story after story of officers where it emerges their behaviour, they're being sacked from the organisation. And whilst that is really challenging to our reputation and trust and confidence in the service, from my perspective, it's really important that we carry on doing that. And we will see more stories that are negative stories because the organisations are dealing with those issues.
Well, I was just looking very briefly about some of the things that were in the report around senior officers pursuing women officers for sex, viewing pornography at work, insulting comments about women and their appearance, and this issue of the booty patrols, where police officers were stopping pretty women. You weren't shocked by that then? You kind of knew this was all going on? I find them, I didn't know that was all going on, obviously, but I find those shocking and disgusting, quite frankly. I was just looking at the list of people who've got into the police, who've got, well, I assume, racially aggravated violence, someone who'd exposed himself 7 times over a 2-week period, someone who was known to be a pimp. I mean, so there's clearly a big problem, as this report highlights, with the vetting process.
Is the vetting working to make sure we're getting the right people in? I think the answer, absolutely, for 2 reasons. One is the process as it exists now is not being applied with sufficient consistency and rigour. The second reason, there are improvements in the vetting process that we need to make in the authorised professional practice. There is clearly that is not doing its job to the extent that we would expect it. However, there are many tens of thousands of absolutely fantastic vocational public-spirited people coming into policing.
Pretty compelling, that session there of the Home Affairs Select Committee. I mean, there's also been concern over what are said to be secret Chinese police operations in the UK, something the Security Minister Tom Tugendhat faced questions on. What was he asked?
Yes, now this is an interesting and strange story. There was a report this week that said right across the world, China has been operating these secret police stations with a view to intimidating and silencing dissidents. Now, Beijing has denied it, but the report did suggest that there were 3 of those stations in the UK. So, as you say, the Security Minister, Tom Tugendhat, making his dispatch box debut in the Commons in his new job, was brought to the Commons by an urgent question because MPs wanted to know, first of all, if this was true, and then second of all, what the government intended to do about it.
The protection of people in the United Kingdom is of the utmost importance, and any attempt to illegally repatriate any individual will not be tolerated. This egregious activity is part of a wider trend of authoritarian governments perpetrating transnational repression in an effort to silence their critics overseas and undermine democracy and the rule of law.
Now, publicly, these stations are harmless administrative centres for Chinese nationals, but reports suggest that actually, in fact, they are used to hunt down dissidents and alleged Chinese criminals. Now, the Chinese government has admitted their existence, and so my questions to the Minister are, what is the legal basis for their operations on UK soil? Are Chinese officials involved in the administration? And I welcome that he's tasked an investigation, but can he commit to update the House on that investigation in due course? We are playing a dangerous game, sacrificing our sovereignty and the safety of not just British nationals, but also refugees at the altar of not wanting to upset an authoritarian state.
The reports she mentions are not exclusive to this country. Sadly, we have seen authoritarian states exercising repressive tendencies abroad and seeking to extradite or indeed to inveigle citizens of their own country back to their homeland in order to extract punishment. This is simply unacceptable. The protections of the UK state need to apply to all those in the United Kingdom, and it is absolutely essential that those protections are afforded to all. That is why I am working and will work further with police and agencies to make sure that we are on top of this offence and make sure that should evidence be shown, should proof be made, that then action will be taken.
There have been multiple reports that these stations are cracking down on Chinese political dissidents, including Hong Kong expats and Uyghur refugees. According to the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, people from Hong Kong relocating to the UK have been followed, harassed, attacked and intimidated by operatives based at the Glasgow station.
The reality is that there is no police force in this country that has jurisdiction except for the police forces of the United Kingdom, and she's absolutely right to say that no foreign force should have ability to influence or detain or hold or pressurise citizens of our country except those which are agreed to by law.
What we are seeing now here is a litany of general excuses from the government, not from him directly, but they've had to be dragged to the House twice a week ago to come and talk about the Manchester punishment beating that was meted out. No statement was offered. Again, another UQ, which I congratulate my old friend. But this business about these police stations has been well known and well documented for ages. Every other country that's got them is now investigating with a view to getting rid of them. Canada, Chile, Germany, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Sweden and the Netherlands are all about to kick them out, including the USA. But we, as yet, have still not undertaken a full investigation. Even in Scotland, the First Minister has decided to investigate the Glasgow site. We have done nothing about these two sites here in England.
We've had increasingly tough words for too long. What we haven't had is a realistic and robust defence of our democratic values and our democratic institutions. So can the government now get real on this?
I have to confess, when I first received emails from constituents, I thought this was some kind of hoax. And when I saw the address that was given for where this police station is supposed to be, it's an address that a business that has written to me recently asking for a meeting. So I, at first, thought it couldn't possibly be true, but it appears now that the reality is much more alarming. So I am grateful to the Minister for stating he'll come back to the House and tell us what his investigations have found. But I wonder if he could give some reassurance to the people of Croydon, and in particular the citizens from China and Hong Kong that live in my constituency, that they will be safe. And perhaps he might agree to meet with me to talk about what may or may not be happening in the middle of my town.
A commitment to all citizens of the United Kingdom and all citizens in the United Kingdom is equally valid to wherever they come from, whichever community they may come from. Of course, I will make that commitment to meet with her, and I'll be delighted to hear more.
Sean, you'll have heard in the headlines the story about the UK's worst ever outbreak of avian flu, with turkey farmers warning of a shortage this Christmas. MPs heard from the Environment Minister, Mark Spencer. What was he saying?
Yes, well, this is quite a serious situation. As you say, it's the worst outbreak of bird flu in this country. There are already restrictions in place in Norfolk, Suffolk and parts of Essex. From next week, there will be even tighter restrictions, and all poultry keepers will have to keep their birds indoors, and that's going to be a legal restriction, and that will come into force from Monday. So the Minister had come to the Commons to update MPs and to answer their questions. And of course, no great surprise, the big question is, will there be enough turkeys for Christmas?
Outbreaks of avian influenza in both kept and wild birds continue to occur at an unprecedented scale, with cases continuing to be confirmed into year 2 of the outbreak for the first time. October has seen a massive escalation in the number of cases confirmed, with 91 cases of highly pathogenic avian influenza confirmed in poultry and captive birds. Farmers who breed turkeys, geese, ducks or capons for their meat will have the option to slaughter their flocks early and freeze products, which can then be defrosted and sold to consumers between the 28th of November and the 31st of December 22.
Yesterday, the government finally announced that a full bird housing order will come into effect from Monday, the 7th of November. That's come in too late, with over 3 million birds being culled already. So why did it take so long? And we know what the problem is. the shortage of vets, a lack of catchers, of colours. The vets, of course, went back to Spain and Portugal, but his department had no plan or capacity to deal with any crisis, and now we've got one.
Using the lessons learnt from COVID and indeed from previous foot and mouth outbreaks, what steps is my right honourable friend taking to ensure that the public know what to do if they come across sick or dead birds as they go about their everyday lives?
My advice to members of the public is not to interfere with those dead birds, not to pick them up and not to move them, but to report them to their local authority if they see them dying on the roadside.
Avian flu is completely rife within the wild bird population. It is absolutely heartbreaking to walk in the beaches of the Northern Isles at the moment to see the number of dead birds that are washed up there all the time. The RSP told me last week that it's possible that, some species like the great skua, maybe not the most sympathetic species, but could actually be threatened as a consequence of this. So what more can you do than biosecurity that is going to ensure that you break that link between the wild bird and the domestic population?
Biosecurity is the best available tool to us, but as he identifies, this continues to spread in wild bird populations. We, to a certain extent, have to hope that nature finds a way of resolving this on its own, and that those birds who do have immunity to the virus will be able to breed with other birds that have immunity and build up their own natural immunity to overcome this terrible virus.
Can I ask the Minister if he can confirm if all resources to address outbreaks and prevention are being made available in terms of finance and compensation, labour and gas stocks, but particularly with regards compensation? Can he confirm adequate finance to pay it and that it will be paid promptly?
I think it's worth acknowledging that farmers aren't interested in compensation. They want to keep their flocks safe, and the best way in which they can do that is through biosecurity. Now, that's not just about washing Wellington boots and washing hands, of course. It's when you're introducing bedding into that household. If you're storing that bedding outside, there's a risk at that moment in time it's come in contact with infected bird feces. So absolute scrutiny and biosecurity of all the measures that they're taking on farm is essential to try and prevent the spread.
Mark Spencer answering questions there about avian flu. Now, of course, there was the big debate, Sean, about whether or not the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, would attend COP27, the big climate conference in Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, we were told, first of all, of course, he wouldn't be going, focusing very keenly on that statement on the 17th of November. Then he might be going if there was time. And now he is going. What sort of, explain the sort of background to that?
Well, I mean, interestingly, the announcement came just before Prime Minister's questions. And in fact, actually, whilst environment ministers were talking about COP26, which was the conference that was held in the UK last year, there was an interesting sort of backlash, I think, because it did look as though the Prime Minister had maybe made a decision too soon. He'd maybe said he wasn't going too soon, and then there was a backlash. And of course, he did face criticism from his own party, including from Alex Sharma, who'd been the president of COP26.
He was disappointed, wasn't
Very
he?
disappointed, said he should be there. And so now Rishi Sunak is going to go there for a short period of time, so he will be there with other world leaders, and then he will be back. And perhaps then we might even hear a statement from the Prime Minister when he returns. Who knows? But Parliament is only sitting for 3 weeks.
3 days.
3 days, not a 3-day week, a 3-day week at Westminster. So it will depend upon whether there is enough time. But we do expect him to be there for Prime Minister's questions.
Thank you very much, Sean. That's all we have time for Politics UK this week. I'll be back with you on BBC Two at 12:15 on Monday with Politics Live. Bye-bye.